Welcome back. You're still watching NTV Weekend Edition, and on Talk of the Nation tonight, we saw that this week President Museveni traveled to the Tanzanian capital, Dar es Salaam, where the two countries joined the oil firms CNOOC and Total in signing a host agreement for the East African crude oil pipeline. It is the third in a series of agreements among the other four parties. So tonight, once again, we have Kampala lawyer DENIS KAKEMBO, a specialist in petroleum law, about what this agreement means for the ordinary Ugandan citizen. A very good evening and welcome to NTV Talk of the Nation.
Thanks, Sandra. It's a great pleasure being on the show once again.
Well, previously when we had you on the show, we talked a lot about the two previous host meetings, but today we want to understand this most recent meeting. What does it mean, and does it change anything? Okay.
Now, on 11th of April 2021, there was a high-powered meeting at State House Entebbe, and that meeting was attended by Tanzania President, Her Excellency Samia Suluhu, then Total President and CEO Patrick Poyen, and then Uganda President, and then CNOOC, which was represented by its President. In that meeting, quite a number of agreements were signed. Not all the agreements which had to be signed were actually completed. Now, the agreements which were signed had one that was to do with the shareholding for the East African crude oil pipeline, and that was signed by all the parties. But there was an issue that remained pending, and the issue which remained pending was the shareholding that Tanzania would take up in the project. So Tanzania was given up to 30 days to confirm their stake in the ECO project, and I understand they've now confirmed that it would be taking up 15% in the crude oil pipeline. Now, Uganda signed a host government agreement with Total and CNOOC, who are the project sponsors for the East African Crude Oil Pipeline Company. And the host government agreement is like an implementation agreement. So all the details around the tax incentives, around how environment is going to be handled, around how local content is going to be dealt with, are spelled out in that host government agreement. So Uganda signed its part of the agreement. Now, the part of Tanzania, or the host government agreement that Tanzania had to sign, was not signed that day. And the reason why it wasn't signed that day, there were a few issues which the President of Uganda had to agree upon with Madam Samia Suluhu. And those issues, I think, were concluded only in the morning, and it made it impossible that the host government agreement between Uganda and the oil companies could be signed then. So that is the agreement which was signed in Tanzania. It's the only one which had been pending. The tariff and transport agreement had been signed. Now, of course, we are at a stage where everyone is hoping that project activities can actually commence, that the actual construction can actually commence. Now, before the actual construction commences, the oil companies have to make sure that all agreements have been signed. And then also, you need to have in place the East African Crude Oil Pipeline Company. Now, you could not have that company in place before parties could commit to the shareholding they are taking. Now, after the company has been set up, you need to have a similar agreement like Uganda has with the East African Crude Oil Pipeline in Tanzania. And that is the agreement which was signed. So it's a continuation of the process that will eventually lead us to the actual commencement of construction activities. Well,
before we got back on air just talking about this issue, you personally mentioned just how much everyone is hearing about the East African crude oil pipeline and how so many people are eager to see it start. This latest meeting, for a Ugandan that is looking for an opportunity, for instance, to invest, what does it mean to them?
Yes. Now, I think for purposes of managing public expectations, it's not going to be one big bang announcement, or it's not going to be one big bang commencement of construction. It is a series of small steps that would eventually lead us to the actual construction. If you've been reading in the press this week, there's a construction company called Motor Engil, which has been engaged by Total to start clearing the areas where the project works are going to be done, the construction. Now, in itself, that is not such big news. But actually, the project has kicked off because they are clearing those areas so that when the actual construction of the pipeline commences, they find areas which have already been cleared. So essentially what we are seeing happening today in terms of these agreements being concluded, it's to prepare us for that. But then also further to that, we have to note that there's another outstanding issue, and that is the law. It's called the East African Crude Oil Pipeline Law. It's not yet been passed by Parliament. Now that is a key agreement. Before you have rather key legislation, before you have that legislation in place, you cannot expect construction to commence. And I believe as soon as the Speaker is elected, and as soon as Parliament commences, the new Parliament commences its business, one of the first issues it's going to consider would be passing that East African Crude Oil Pipeline Bill. But substantially, from what we see happening, because at this point in time, major tenders have been put out. If you read in the press, you're seeing expressions of interest and requests for proposals, which are being outed. So, as soon as the winners of those projects are announced, which we expect should be imminent, because what was holding back the announcement of some key winners for the pipeline company was because there was no company. Tanzania and everyone else had not yet fully committed to the shareholding they're taking. But now that it's in place, it can now be fully constituted, and it can chair meetings, it can have the shareholders attend, directors appointed, and then they can make formal announcements regarding who is going to do the construction and all that.
Speak to us about the final investment decision. When you were here previously, you talked about how there were some issues that we needed to rectify before we get to that. What does it take for us to get to that point?
Substantially, all issues have been cleared. Now, the oil companies had about 7 issues which they tasked the government to clear before they could formally agree to kick off the project. Now, about 3 of those issues related to tax, the others related to finalization of the agreements, which have substantially been concluded. So, a few residual issues, like, when the presidents met on 11th of April, no one had not expected that the host government between Tanzania would not be signed. It indeed wasn't signed. No one had not expected Tanzania would not commit to the shareholding they would take up. They only committed just, I think, a few days ago, and then also the host government agreement. So, majorly all the issues have been cleared, and it's just a question of time. Like now, if you have the East African Crude Oil Pipeline Bill in place, and then announcement of the key major winners, the winners of projects, guys who are going to build like the Tilenga, that is one of the production plants, or even Kingfisher. Once they are announced, then you'd expect that real action should commence.
We've also had concerns, also you who's watching us tonight, that this project is likely to distort budgetary plans, with more supplementaries likely to come out from the Parliament. What would you say to that? And how can we move about the investment without necessarily increasing our debt burden?
Okay. Yeah, it is true. You can't reap where you've not sowed. So Uganda wants to take part in some of these projects, and to take part in some of these projects means that you have to set aside money so that you invest. In fact, one of the concerns which was raised by parliamentarians when the Uganda National Oil Company through Ministry of Finance went to Parliament to ask for permission to fund the pipeline, to borrow money to fund the pipeline, the issue that MPs raised was that why is Uganda only taking up 15% stake in the pipeline? They had forgotten that if Uganda was to take up 100% stake in the pipeline, it would have to foot the $3.5 billion. So it's inevitable that Uganda has to spend some money, and because that money is not readily available, certainly the only way available to obtain it is through borrowing. But looking at the benefits, of course, if you determine that you're going to raise financing for building the pipeline, the project will kick off. And then also the upstream production facilities construction will commence. Now, recently, CNOOC was given permission to borrow $130 million in 1 year, and then I think even next year they'll have to get an additional $130 million, and then even the other year, so it comes about $400 million. But in 3 years, if you're borrowing $400 million and you're unlocking investment of about $15 billion, of which about 40% of that is going to be retained in the economy in terms of direct spend. But more to that, lots of companies are going to set up and they'll be paying taxes even before first oil kicks in. I would not have an issue with that, because it's not a bad decision to borrow if you're going to unlock such huge investment. You're only borrowing $400 million, but you're unlocking over $4 billion that is going to be
what
retained
about
locally.
the time frame of getting back those returns? Can you estimate for us?
Certainly, I mean, I can't speak to that. I don't have the numbers before me, but from a high level point of view, you're borrowing $400 million in 3 years, and you're retaining $4 billion locally. Now, if you're retaining $4 billion locally, it's being spent. And assuming everyone that participates in the value chain makes a profit of $2 billion, that's a total profit, and you take 30% of that, in corporation tax alone, that gives you about $680 million. Now, there are employees who you're going to pay, and when you pay them, you have to pay taxes like pay as you earn, which would also contribute money to government coffers. But even after the 3 years, when oil production commences, it's projected that Uganda would, the revenues from oil production alone at gross level per year would be between $2 to $3 billion. Now, $3 billion, the government could probably take maybe 30% of that as government revenue. So you're borrowing $400 million, but in 4 years' time, you have assured $1 billion. It's not a bad decision if that money is utilized well.
Now, speaking about utilizing, let us speak to that. In the past, we've had situations and concerns of corruption, misuse, unfairness. For such a huge investment to come forward, those concerns are always there.
Yes.
Do you foresee those happening at the same time? And if you were to probably present a solution to the government so that we avoid money being misused, being unfairly distributed, how would you advise them?
Now, fortunately, government has been cognizant of the fact that when oil production commences, lots of revenues would come in.
Yes.
And one of the first steps which was undertaken was passing the Public Finance Management Act. I think it was passed in 2014. And the Public Finance Management Act establishes a petroleum fund. And that petroleum fund ring fences revenues that are going to come from the oil and gas sector. What that would mean is that that petroleum fund is going to be managed separately, and there are clear and tight guidelines around how money can be taken out of that fund so that it's not misused. But more to that, the civil society has also been pushing for more transparency and accountability in the sector, and they were able to convince government to sign up to the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. The notion behind the Extractive Transparency Initiative is to compare the fiscal receipts that government discloses as having been earned from the oil companies, and then compare with what the oil companies have declared as payments that are made to the government. If there's any discrepancy, that would be a red flag which could point towards corruption. So there are some measures already in place which can help us in that regard. But then we also have a new parliament. Parliament plays an oversight role to ensure that the executive arm of government exercises its mandate fairly well. And this is an area where I would urge the next parliament, the current parliament now, which was recently sworn in, especially the committee dealing with energy, to pay keen attention so that they advise and then also ensure that government utilizes the revenues from the oil sector well.
There are also reports that a Tanzanian president is likely to be returning to Uganda soon. I do not know if you are aware of that, but even then, what remains to be seen, or what remains to be resolved moving ahead? What is the next step after this latest meeting?
Well, I can't speak authoritatively on whether Her Excellency Samia Suluhu will be coming in to the country. But if she's to come in, I wouldn't be surprised, because just, I think last week she visited Kenya on a state visit. When I think she came here, it wasn't a state visit of sorts. I mean, she had only gotten into power, and then she came here to sign those agreements. But I believe as a new president, she needs to come here and meet the wider business community so that reaffirm the bilateral nature of relationship outside oil and gas, but even other business spheres that Tanzania and Uganda have. So probably that could be the reason why she could come here. But on the oil and gas front, I think all the agreements that Uganda and Tanzania and the oil companies had to enter into and conclude have been concluded. The only issue pending is the law implementing the pipeline agreements, both on the side of Tanzania and on the side of Uganda, which are already in progress to be passed.
All right, thank you so much, DENIS KAKEMBO, a lawyer that has just joined us speaking to us about the East African crude oil pipeline. We do thank you as well for joining us tonight. We'll keep you updated on that and so much more. NTV Weekend Edition will take a short break, but of course we'll return with sports.